The Last of Us Part 2 is a game totally obsessed with The Last of Us Part 1. Strangers, this is not a game that tries to escape the shadow of its predecessor. Rather, much of its runtime is dedicated to ruminating on the events of that game and coming to terms with its final conclusions. Even during parts of our game that seem to move far away from the previous plot, we will always return. It's why we begin with a recap. The Last of Us Part 1 is about a man named Joel Miller. Joel is a master of this 2 decades old zombie apocalypse, made exceptional by his cunning in battle and his wit in survival. He takes in a teenage girl named Ellie, who might contain the cure for the zombie plague, and transports her across the fallen United States. This could make Ellie the most important person on Earth, but to Joel, her value lies in the bond forged between them. Joel lost his daughter when he lost his world, and 20 years later, the pain has rendered him a shell of his former self. By becoming a father to Ellie and helping her deal with her pain and her trauma, Joel is coaxed in becoming a joyous human being again. He is healed by this girl, but when forces conspire to take her away from him, he reveals the strength that's allowed him to survive for so long. First, a group of cannibals capture her, so Joel tortures 2 of them for her location before carving a path of bodies to her. Shortly after, Joel delivers Ellie to a group called the Fireflies, who aim to save the world. Save the world by creating a cure, and creating a cure by harvesting Ellie's brain. But there can be no world for Joel without the one that made his worth living in. Joel fights his way through dozens of armed guards before wiping the Fireflies off the map, brutally killing their leader and their top scientist. So at the end of the game, we're left with a man we've seen in 2 very different lights. Joel is now a much more likable and happy man, freed from cynicism to hope and breathe again, and yet we've seen him torture and murder, covering himself in blood to reach this moment. How do we square these 2 realities? How do we comprehend this man who is at once a loving father and a heartless psychopath? Ellie faces a similar challenge. Joel lies to her after he murders the Fireflies. After a years-long quest to reach them, become the cure, and save humanity, Joel gaslights his daughter, telling her that her destiny was never going to happen. The game ends with us trying to make up our minds about who Joel is, just as Ellie is struggling between believing the man she's come to love and denying an obvious lie. Who is Joel Miller? This is a question that is at the heart of The Last of Us 1, and its sequel does not run away from this question, instead wrapping it into the very depths of its narrative. But it also adds another question about Joel. Who is his heir? Like I said, this is a game obsessed with its predecessor. As many others were, The Last of Us was one of the warmest received games of all time, achieving near universal praise and acclaim, aspiring even Q-tier YouTubers to make analysis videos about it 7 years after its release. And so its sequel was hotly demanded and anticipated, even through delays resulting from the game's complexity and the COVID pandemic. To feed this lust for fan service, the opening of The Last of Us Part 2 is drenched in nostalgia, as a free and happy Joel rides a horse through a beautiful field. Joel is ripped from our control as quickly as he arrives, and we spend the next 2 hours of the game feverishly trying to get to him. He pops back into our story out of nowhere before being ripped away for good. I'm sure most of us could have seen this coming, but few would have anticipated how quickly The Last of Us kills off its previous protagonist. Ellie watches in horror as Joel's skull is cracked open by her antagonist, the savage Abby, who monologues about the righteousness of Joel's death and her desire to make it slow even as she kills him. Joel is dead. His story is over. He leaves behind only Ellie's desire to avenge him and the question of who is he? We walk through Joel's house, brimming with detail about who he was. We see his skill in wood carving, his love for old music, brought together in his quest to restore old guitars. Ellie swears revenge. Abby was from Seattle, a part of the Washington Liberation Front. And we spend the bulk of our game there as Abby and crew attempt to avenge Joel. Ellie leaves everything to track down her father's killer, bringing only a horse, some guns, and a girlfriend, ready to go up against who knows what. And we are left to question, how much does she know about Joel? She freely admits that Joel made a lot of enemies, and this probably resulted in him being hunted down by Ellie and her crew. But how much does she know about the events of the last game? What did she think of Joel in the end? The answer to that question will change as we progress our story, but at the beginning, she seems to know nothing of Joel's crimes and not care about them. Even if she didn't truly know her father, she shows him deference, dragging herself a quarter of a way across the country for him and deep into enemy territory. Ellie carves a path of blood through Seattle, taking down numerous members of the WLF and their opposing faction, the Seraphites, along with horrific new undead. On this path with her is her lover Dina, who acknowledges the righteousness of her cause, while slowly beginning to question Ellie's ferocity. Ellie doesn't seem satisfied with just tracking down her father's killer. She eagerly plans to capture and interrogate each member of Abby's squad on her way to reach her. Ellie fights mostly in self-defense, as the WLF and the Seraphites, more commonly referred to as the Wolves and the Scars, often shoot on sight, but she also demonstrates her capacity for barbarism as she beats information out of one of Abby's allies and then goes on to murder two more of them, one of which was pregnant. Ellie spirals deeper and deeper into violence. Her battles leave scars and wounds on her body, and yet she soldiers on, and we are left to wonder, how much is the daughter like the father? Joel's blood does not flow through her veins, and yet Ellie is like him all the same, with the will to survive and fight and torture and kill. Violence is done to her, and she does violence in kind, driven by an inner rage and pain that forces the pipe from her hand and the blade from her fingers. The daughter has the father's rage, but not his steel. Ellie is racked with guilt for what she has done. It weighs on her soul. Many of her kills were accidental, and she mourns for the pregnant Mel, whose life she never intended to end. Guilt swirls around Ellie's brain, doubling and redoubling with the rage that spirals around it. One moment she's a funny lover, the next a revenant of death, and we cannot help but compare her to Joel as she goes down a darker and darker path. But wait, Joel was never motivated by revenge. He fought to protect himself and Ellie. His kills were calculated and reasoned. He never hurt for the sake of hurting, and he never felt regret either. Joel was gifted with a psychopathy that erased his regrets, unlike the kind daughter he cared for. Ellie can never be the heir to the monstrosity of Joel. Her rage is different, and her heart is mixed with kindness and light. No, if we want to see a proper heir to Joel, if we want to see him manifested into this game once again, we need to look at the other protagonist of The Last of Us Part 2. We need to talk about Abby Anderson. Abby is the subject of this game's wildest gambit. I haven't checked up on much of the discourse around this game because I like to write in a vacuum, but I imagine her implementation is the game's most controversial decision. After playing through a 12 to 15 hour campaign as Ellie fights her way through 3 days in Seattle, Abby invades her hideout, kills Jesse, pins down Tommy, and has Ellie at gunpoint. This is it, the conclusion of our story, the pinnacle of drama. It's about to be over until... cut to black. Just as we've reached what seems to be our end, The game has you play through another 10-hour campaign as you see these 3 days from Abby's perspective, culminating in a final boss fight as you play as Abby as she fights Ellie and wins the day. This choice to cut away from our protagonist and then have us play through the other half of the game as the character who was previously the villain is, whatever you think of it, a bold decision. At first, I completely hated it because we play as Abby, and I hate Abby. I bet you hated Abby too. I think you're supposed to hate Abby. I mean, she kills Joel, and the front half of this game is dedicated to making Joel as likable as possible. After the first day in Seattle, we have this long flashback sequence of him just like being the best dad ever as he and Ellie explore an old museum, with the game reaching levels of moe that I frankly did not think the Americans were capable of. This scene is a saccharine explosion of nostalgia and good vibes, as is the next flashback after the day 2, where we see more of Joel being a good dad, showing an interest in Ellie's passions and letting her take on more responsibility. Joel was caring for his daughter as she entered adulthood, protecting a community and growing into a distinguished retirement. Abby snuffed that life out. First, we find out why. When Joel rescued Ellie from the Fireflies, he killed their head scientist, which just happened to be Abby's father. Abby took Ellie's father from her just as Joel took Abby's father away. Her pain is valid. It has to be satisfied. Abby leaves Salt Lake City in the sight of her father's murder. She joins the WLF, where within 4 years, she becomes one of their most prized and dangerous soldiers, with their leader Isaac entrusting her to lead an assault on the Seraphite homeland. Think about that for a moment. Abby can't be more than 22 at the oldest, and yet she's one of this organization's greatest soldiers, referred to as their top scar killer. Abby certainly distinguishes herself in combat. She's stronger and boasts a more combat-centric arsenal than Ellie, killing an action hero amount of opponents throughout the game. Despite the action and world building, I felt the opening hours of Abby's section to be boring and obtuse. Just when we reach the peak of narrative tension, we're thrown to a place of zero tension, wandering around the WLF base. You're back in time, the player forced to interact with all of the people who you've already killed, playing as Ellie. It goes on and on. The whole time I was just jonesing to get back to Ellie, to get back to the real story. I mean, that's what I care about. Abby, her story sucks. She's bad and boring and I hate her. I want Ellie to beat her face in. That is what I am here for. And then Abby's section starts to get good. After going AWOL from the WLF to find her former lover, Owen, Abby is captured by the Seraphites and eventually rescued by 2 Seraphite children who are being persecuted by their own faction. These 3 help each other in an alignment of survival, but even after Abby leaves them to find Owen, whom she has sex with, guilt and caring compel her to go and check on them. From there, we are thrown into a gauntlet of increasingly interesting scenarios as other characters bring out the best in Abby. Owen tries to show her hope of a better life she's long since abandoned, and the kids give her something to protect, a reason to fight other than revenge or conquest. She cares about Yara and Lev. So do we. Not only do they deliver interesting world building about the Seraphites, but they bring with them some endearing character traits and elegant storytelling. They're also just cute as hell. Abby gets a very humanizing moment as she conquers her fear of heights with Lev. She jeopardizes her own career and puts herself into great danger trying to get medical supplies for Yara as we see her brave crushing adversity. Soon, Abby is far more dedicated to these kids than she is to the wolves, and she clings to them even tighter as Seattle falls apart around her. Abby travels with Yara to the Seraphite home base in search of Lev, who, by the way, is my son and must be protected at all costs, just as the WLF invades. Abby is declared a traitor to her own faction just before their leader is killed and the island is plunged into a hellscape of carnage. Yara is killed and Abby fights with everything she has just to keep her and Lev alive, returning to find her friends murdered by Ellie. Now all she has is Lev and hate. Hate that drives her to fight Ellie, who becomes the final boss of Abby's sequence. Abby wins and is only stopped from killing Ellie and Dina by Lev's urgings. She could do more. She could go further. She could bring more hate into this world, but what would that give her? Instead, she leaves, inspired by the purity of Lev's soul. When we see her a year later, Abby is a changed woman. Now she steps with purpose, not only in nurturing Lev, but also in trying to find the Fireflies and resume fighting for a better world. At this point, Abby was a complex and well-rounded character, who I was glad to see grow and change for the better. Our next to final scene shows what's at the very bottom of Abby's heart. Ellie tracks her down once again, only to find Abby reduced as far as possible. Captured and strung up to die, Abby is a desperate shell, far flung from the brutal warrior that Ellie once fought. Reduced down as far as she can go, Abby's only goal is not her own life, but Lev. She cuts him down and carries him to safety, desperately trying to save a life more valuable than her own. It's laudable, it's honorable, it's compelling. But wait, Abby is a monster. Think about how many scars she carves her way through, how easy it is for her to turn on her own faction. Think of how little remorse she has for her kills. Think about what she's probably had to do in order to earn her position amongst the wolves. This is the argument that Mel makes. After being tired of being nice, Mel lashes out at the woman that's always repulsed her. Mel is disgusted by Abby, by her violence, by her savagery, by the fact that she can murder and torture and never feel bad about it. And even if we find Abby compelling, we have to admit that she is exceptional. Her brain is broken in a way that allows her to commit this violence. She is a psychopathic... Wait. We have a character who is a psychopathic killer, able to overcome massive adversity because they're basically an action hero, who's human enough to be likable but inhuman enough to disgust, who is redeemed and shown a better life by taking care of an adorable teenager. Who does this remind me of? Abby is the heir to Joel. That's not to say it's a perfect copy of the arc. Abby's crimes are far more implied, compensated for by the audience's initial hatred of her after she kills Joel. Abby is also far younger, and that makes a big difference, but the parallels are there all the same. In Seattle, Abby loses everything she ever cared about: her friends, her cause, her lover. And this leads her to extreme acts of violence before a pure soul gives her hope for a better life. Just like Joel at the end of the last game, this game's epilogue sees Abby a changed woman, more serene and hopeful, looking towards the future, encouraging in her words. Abby has grown. She can move on. But Ellie can't let her move on. Abby is forced to track down Abby a second time, compelled by the screaming of her own mind. Joel's final moments haunt her dreams. His legacy rages in her soul. She must kill for him. It's the only way she'll find peace. By this point, we've also learned that Ellie and Joel's relationship wasn't as amicable as we first suspected. She eventually tired of his lies, and once she learns of his crimes at the Firefly home base, she was horrified. Sickened by Joel's actions, she swore to never talk to him again, ending their relationship. And yet she still wants to kill for him. Ellie leaves a peaceful life, a partner that loves her, a son she can raise, she turns her back on them so she can track down Abby a year after the first time almost killed her. When Ellie confronts the weakened Abby in California, Abby does not wish to fight. Ellie has to force her. She can't get Joel's dead face out of her head. That face, those eyes she can't draw, haunts her. She's come so far, it has to mean something, and so the two clash, savagery returning savagery. After punches and stabs, Ellie finally gets one over on her opponent, dragging Abby into the water and drowning her head under the Pacific. Abby fights and flails as Abby holds her down, begging to drown her in the ocean. Her grip tightens as she thinks about why she's doing this, to avenge her father, to bring her peace, to kill this bitch for doing this to her. It's going to be over, it's going to be done, until Ellie lets go. Abby resurfaces and escapes, leaving Ellie to kneel in the wake of her quest. All that effort for nothing. Why does Ellie let go of Abby's neck? Why does she break the cycle of violence? Because this game is about a cycle of violence. Joel killed Abby's dad, so Abby killed Joel. So Ellie killed Abby's friends, so Abby kills Ellie's friends. On and on. This story is framed within another cycle of violence, that of the Seraphites and the WLF. The Scars and the Wolves are tearing Seattle apart. They've been fighting for years, with both sides thinking the other to be blind monsters. It's unclear why these two sides are at war. They aren't exactly clashing over resources. They seem to be only fighting out of hatred for the other, which is justified. Both sides commit monstrous acts and shoot outsiders on sight. There have been several attempts at peace between the two sides, but none of them have lasted. Isaac, the leader of the Wolves, articulates a theory for why this is the case. He acknowledges that the Scars might agree to another truce, but thinks it will eventually be broken by, quote, some asshole on their side or ours. According to Isaac, a random act of violence will eventually manifest and be answered by another. Soon, all will be fighting again. The only way to extinguish the fire of violence is to drown it in blood. This results in the Wolves' attack on the Scars' homeland, villages burning and children dying. And what happens to Isaac? Well, he's shot in the back and dies on the ground like an animal. See, these are the wages of hatred. Death and destruction is the only thing you'll find at the end of a cycle. During the final battle, Abby bites off 2 of Ellie's fingers, and when she returns home, she is less of a woman than when she left. Abby biting off 2 of Ellie's fingers has permanently inhibited her ability to play guitar, an action that spiritually connects Ellie to Joel, who is teaching her to play guitar in many of the game's flashbacks. With her father dead, playing guitar is one of the only ways Ellie can feel connected to him. And now that has been damaged. Abby took away Ellie's connection to Joel just as Joel took away Abby's father from her. In a brutally truthful way, the only wage of violence is loss and hate, which compels us to more unnecessary violence. Or was it unnecessary? Abby and her crew risked their lives crossing the country to kill Joel, and Ellie didn't hesitate to hunt Abby down. Even with every incentive to stay with Dina, Ellie is forced by the torment of her own mind to track down Abby. The screaming has to stop. The hatred must be satisfied, and yet in the final moment of climax, it all slips away. Ellie let go of Abby's neck. The hate ran out. Why did her hate run out? Why did Abby's hate run out? Abby could have killed Ellie and her kin, stopping them from threatening her ever again, and yet she is stopped by a cry from Lev, her last companion left. If Abby is the heir to Joel, then Lev is this game's version of the last game's Ellie. He is the pure soul that redeems the broken warrior. Lev is compelling and adorable and wants nothing to do with this cycle of violence, instead hoping that the two sides can come together, understanding the peaceful intentions of the prophet. Unfortunately, Lev is born into a world that threatens his survival and a culture that casts him out. His people turn on him, his sister is killed, and Abby is the only thing keeping him alive. But in turn, he gives Abby the hope to keep going. And we can see when she is stripped of everything else, her only desire is to protect Lev and the pure soul inside him. But it was Lev's pure soul that forced her to stop the cycle of violence. So why does Ellie stop? When she is kneeling in the water, drowning Abby, why does she let go? What does she see? She sees Joel. Who is Joel Miller? What is he? What is he to us? What is he to Ellie? Ellie learned who he was. She confronted every horror of the man who protected her, and spent a year trying to stay away from him and cut him out of her life. But he never stopped loving her. In the game's finale, we see what transpired the night before Joel's death. After a year of brooding and pushing him away, Ellie timidly approaches him on the porch. She lets out all on her mind, giving form to the emotions raging inside her, and at the end she realizes she wants to be with him. Because Joel may be a killer, he may be an avatar of ruin, but he's also the man who saved her, who comforted her and taught her and laughed with her and loved with her. He's the man who became her dad. When Ellie sees Joel one more time, she decides who Joel Miller was. He wasn't a murderer to be feared, or a corpse to be avenged. He was a loving man who played guitar on his porch. Joel is Ellie's pure soul. A pure soul who will never truly leave her. Ellie lets go, Abby leaves, and she is left with damage and loss, a family she may never get back. But she has decided who Joel is to her. She knew who he was in total, and yet she chooses to take the good. The memory of Joel's death compelled her to kill, but the memory of his life compelled her to stop. Now all she is left with is tragedy. As was Abby, after the horror that Joel wrought on her. As was Joel, after he lost his daughter all those years ago. This is a cruel and painful world. Loss happens out of nowhere, and hate permeates every group. You will lose all you love. But Joel moved on with the help of a girl. Abby moved on with the help of a boy. Ellie was a pure soul, a soul pure enough to drive out the brokenness from Joel. And now he has become a pure soul for her, which proves, even as she walks off, having lost everything, that there's hope for her too. I am Wyatt the Word Weaver, and that is what I took from the story of The Last of Us Part 2. Subscribe for more that is coming, and follow me on Twitter just to hear all the ranting and screaming I do. Y'all be good.